The world of Sparta was not a place where childhood meant laughter or innocence. It was a forge, and every newborn was a piece of raw iron thrown into fire. When a Spartan child came into the world, their first breath was not greeted with tenderness but judgment. The elders of the Gerousia would lift the infant, inspect its body for deformity or weakness, and decide whether it was worthy to live. Those deemed unfit were left on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, exposed to the elements, an act not born purely of cruelty, but of survival. Sparta could not afford the luxury of compassion. It existed in a world that demanded perfection from birth. This chilling ritual set the tone for everything that followed. Life in Sparta was not about living well. It was about being unbreakable. To understand this ruthless beginning, one must understand what Sparta feared. Surrounded by enemies, outnumbered by the enslaved Helot population, and constantly threatened by internal revolt, Sparta was a fortress built on paranoia. The Spartan state designed itself as a military organism, where every citizen existed for one purpose: defense and dominance. Even its government reflected this duality. Two kings ruled simultaneously, each acting as a counterbalance to the other, ensuring no single man could gain absolute power. Beneath them, the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, preserved the laws of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver who had, according to tradition, turned Sparta into a living weapon. Theirs was not a civilization of art or philosophy like Athens. It was a civilization of endurance. In this world, family love was secondary to duty. Mothers were not expected to raise sons for comfort but for conquest. The phrase that defined the Spartan mother, "Return with your shield or on it," was not metaphorical pride but literal instruction. The concept of childhood itself was stripped of sentimentality. From birth, a boy was property of the state. His parents could feed him, name him, even love him for a few years, but at the age of 7, the state would take him. His life no longer belonged to his family, but to Sparta's military machine. Every institution in Sparta reflected a single obsession: the elimination of weakness. Boys were trained to speak little, eat little, and endure much. Even language served discipline. The Spartans prized brevity, the sharpness of words as a reflection of the sharpness of the blade. Their speech, laconic, became a symbol of calculated strength. Say only what is necessary, act without hesitation. Through this simplicity, Sparta cultivated an identity: pure, unbending, merciless. Yet beneath the iron discipline lay a deeper, darker truth. Fear ruled Sparta as much as strength did. Every ritual, every inspection, every test was born from the terror of becoming vulnerable. It was a society that defined freedom not by individuality, but by control. To be Spartan was to belong entirely to something greater than yourself: the phalanx, the city, the code. And in that belonging, individuality was sacrificed. The story of Spartan childhood begins with this paradox: a civilization that exalted discipline so deeply that it erased the very soul it sought to perfect. The cries of a newborn were not the start of a gentle life but the opening notes of a test that would never end. From the moment they opened their eyes, Spartan children faced a singular truth: to live, they must first prove they deserve to. And as one infant survives the inspection, cradled not in comfort but in expectation, his path is set. Ahead of him lies the agoge, the state's brutal training program that will strip away his softness, reshape his instincts, and turn him into the embodiment of Spartan might. For the child, survival has only just begun. The true battle is about to start. At the age of 7, the boy's childhood ended not with a celebration, but with separation. The day he was taken from his family marked the beginning of his real life, the life owned entirely by the state. No goodbyes, no sentiment. His mother, perhaps with eyes dry from generations of practice, handed him over knowing that softness was forbidden. From that moment on, the boy belonged to the agoge, the most unforgiving education system in human history. Not a school, but a crucible that would burn away weakness until only the warrior remained. The agoge was not merely about learning how to fight. It was about learning how to endure. Boys were divided into groups called herds, each led by an older youth who enforced discipline through pain and fear. The state provided almost nothing, just enough food to survive, just enough clothing to cover their bodies, and just enough warmth to test the edge of their resistance. They were expected to steal food to supplement their rations, but if they were caught, the punishment was not for the theft, it was for being careless enough to get caught. Every rule in the agoge taught one thing: pain is temporary, failure is shameful, and cunning is survival. In this harsh world, boys slept on beds they made from reeds cut with their bare hands. They trained barefoot, summer and winter alike, to harden their flesh against discomfort. Hunger became a constant companion, forcing them to rely on wit and stealth. The instructors, the paidonomos, watched them with the cold eyes of a sculptor studying stone, seeing not children but future instruments of war. They would whip the boys for mistakes, starve them for disobedience, and push them beyond exhaustion until tears and rebellion faded into silent obedience. To survive the agoge was not to become strong of body alone. It was to annihilate weakness of spirit. Among their lessons were music and dance, but even those were military. They sang war songs that praised courage and mocked cowardice, their rhythm matching the cadence of the phalanx march. They learned poetry not for beauty, but for precision, words as weapons, thoughts as discipline. In Sparta, art was not an escape from struggle, it was a reminder of duty. Every element of culture served war. Even laughter was rare, and when it came, it often carried the sharpness of cruelty. The boys were taught to revere their elders and despise softness. They learned to speak little, and when they did, their words cut like knives, laconic, measured, final. They competed constantly, wrestling, racing, fighting barehanded in brutal contests that left bruises as badges of pride. The weak were ridiculed, sometimes beaten by their peers until they learned strength or perished in silence. There was no room for self-pity. Emotion was a weakness the agoge could not tolerate. Every scar was a story of triumph. As the years passed, the boys began to form a brotherhood of endurance. Bonds forged in shared suffering replaced family affection. They learned to rely on one another, not through compassion, but through necessity. The agoge built unity through struggle. When one fell, the others carried him not because they cared, but because the phalanx could not afford a gap. Loyalty was no longer emotional. It was mechanical, born of survival. Yet beneath the surface of this rigid system, something deeply human stirred. Late at night, under the stars of Laconia, the boys whispered to each other about their families, about the sea, about what life might have been if they had been born elsewhere. In those fleeting moments, they remembered that they were children, before the dawn calls shattered the illusion and returned them to the relentless rhythm of discipline. By the time a boy reached his mid-teens, he had become something unrecognizable from the child he once was. His eyes no longer searched for comfort, they searched for command. His body was lean and scarred, his will sharpened like the blade he would one day carry. The agoge had stripped him of individuality, yet in its place, it had given him purpose, to live, fight, and die for Sparta. The transformation was nearly complete, but the most dangerous trial still lay ahead. Before he could become a man, before he could earn his place among the warriors, he would face the test that turned fear into dominance, the rite of blood known as the cryptia. In the shadows of that ritual, the final fragments of innocence would vanish, and a true Spartan would emerge. Night had fallen over Laconia, and with it came the test that would turn boys into predators. After years of pain, hunger, and obedience, the strongest among them were chosen for a secret rite known only to the Spartans, the cryptia. It was a word whispered more than spoken, an initiation that separated those who had merely endured from those who would rule through fear. By this stage, the boy who had survived the agoge no longer thought of himself as a child. His heart was hardened, his body sharpened, and yet, the cryptia demanded more, not just strength, but the willingness to kill without question, to extinguish mercy completely. The ritual was shrouded in silence. Chosen by the Ephesus, the young men were given only a dagger and a cloak, and sent into the countryside alone. Their mission was not training, it was blood. During the night, they stalked the helots, the enslaved people of Sparta, the conquered Messenians who worked the land that fed the warriors. To keep the helot population subdued, terror had to be constant. So each year, the Spartans declared ritual war on them, allowing murder without religious sin. The Cryptia was both a rite of passage and a political tool, a way to remind the enslaved that rebellion meant death in the dark. Moving silently through the moonlight, the young Spartans learned what no lesson in the agoge could teach: the reality of taking a life. Each step on the cold earth was a test of nerve and purpose. They hid by day, emerging only when the shadows stretched long, when a lone helot strayed too far from his fellows. The kill had to be swift, unseen, and unhesitating. Hesitation was weakness. Pity was failure. The moment of the strike, the silent blade cutting through breath and bone, was when a boy ceased to exist. What remained was a Spartan. The state disguised this ritual as necessity, but its real purpose was psychological domination. The Cryptia was meant to teach absolute control, not just over one's fear, but over one's conscience. A Spartan could not afford the burden of guilt. He served the law, not morality. The young men learned that mercy was a disease that could spread and weaken the whole phalanx. In this chilling calculus, the murder of a helot was not a crime, it was civic duty. Survival, once personal, now became political. Yet within the hearts of those who endured it, the cost was immense. Some returned silent and hollow, their eyes carrying the weight of what they had done. Others came back with pride, convinced that they had fulfilled their destiny. The agoge had forged their bodies, but the Cryptia reforged their souls, stripping away empathy until only obedience remained. It was the final step in the making of a Spartan, the death of innocence, replaced by the discipline of cruelty. This system of sanctioned terror ensured that Sparta remained stable while surrounded by enemies. The helots, though vastly outnumbering their masters, lived under a permanent state of fear. They tilled the soil, served their overlords, and whispered prayers in the night for mercy that would never come. To the Spartans, this was necessary order, a world perfectly balanced on control and submission. Every Spartan soldier walking the streets knew that his strength rested upon the terror of those beneath him. Every cry in the night was proof that the system worked. But beneath this facade of stability, the cracks of humanity still lingered. A few of the young warriors, though silent, carried ghosts within them, memories of faces, of blood, of questions they were never allowed to ask. Sparta did not permit remorse. There was no room for reflection in a world where hesitation meant death. And yet, it was this silent conflict, between the man they had become and the child they had lost, that defined the true cost of their upbringing. By the time they returned from the Cryptia, they were no longer boys molded by discipline, but men shaped by fear and power. They had learned the art of silent killing, the mastery of self-denial, and the absolute loyalty demanded by the state. Their transformation was complete. They had conquered weakness, compassion, and individuality, and in doing so, they had become the ideal citizens of Sparta's unyielding vision. Now, with manhood earned in shadow and blood, the next step awaited, the final purpose of their existence: war. The same boys who once trembled in the cold would soon stand shoulder to shoulder in bronze armor, forming the unbreakable wall of the Spartan phalanx. What began as survival in childhood would now be tested in the fire of battle, where the only measure of worth would be whether they could hold the line or die upon it. The years of training and silence ended where it was always meant to, on the battlefield. For the first time, the young Spartan stood in formation, shield to shield, his body one link in a wall of bronze and will. The phalanx was not an army, it was a living organism. Each man's shield protected the man beside him, and each heartbeat moved in rhythm with the next. There was no room for fear or thought, only discipline. When the order came, they advanced in perfect harmony, the earth trembling beneath their march. The clash was sudden and thunderous. Shields slammed, spears splintered, men fell, but the line held. Every movement was instinct: thrust, withdraw, brace, advance. A Spartan did not fight as an individual, he was the phalanx. To falter was to betray the city. Amidst the chaos, there was no glory, only survival. The air reeked of blood and iron, but their training made them unbreakable. They moved like one endless tide, swallowing fear with obedience. When the enemy finally broke, the Spartans did not cheer. They stood in silence, their faces blank, their hearts emptied by victory. That night, as campfires flickered, the warrior stared into the flames. He had done everything Sparta demanded, endured hunger, pain, and death, yet something inside him was gone. He had learned to kill without hesitation, but never to feel without shame. In that stillness, he realized that surviving war was simple. Surviving Sparta would be harder. Returning home brought no peace. The warrior who survived the phalanx was expected to live with the same precision he fought with. Every meal, every movement, every silence was governed by law. The syssitia, communal dining halls, replaced family, where men sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking only of discipline and duty. Life in Sparta was a continuation of war, only quieter. There were no celebrations, no comforts. A warrior's worth ended the moment he showed weakness. Those who could not bear the weight of memory carried it in silence. Sparta had no word for trauma, but its echoes filled the night. Men staring at walls, gripping unseen spears, fighting ghosts they could never name. Emotion was forbidden, compassion, a crack in the armor. Even love bowed to discipline. Husbands and wives met in secret, not for tenderness but for the duty of producing warriors. Women were honored for strength, not softness. And beneath this rigid world, the helots still labored, the invisible hands that fed the machine. Years passed, and the warrior became what Sparta desired: hard, obedient, efficient. Yet sometimes, watching boys enter the agoge, he saw himself, scared, lonely, desperate for approval. The thought struck him like an arrow. Had strength cost him his soul? But he buried it deep, because Sparta did not forgive doubt. He had survived everything: the whip, the hunger, the blade. Yet, in the quiet halls of his city, he realized that endurance without peace is another kind of death. Centuries have passed since the last Spartan phalanx marched into battle, yet the legend endures, sharper and cleaner than the brutal truth ever was. Modern minds remember the heroism of Thermopylae, the fearless warriors who stood against impossible odds, but few recall what it cost to make men capable of such defiance. Sparta's story has become a symbol of strength, of discipline, of courage, but the reality beneath that symbol is far more complex. What it took to survive a Spartan childhood was not merely resilience of body, but the sacrifice of the very things that make us human. The world has long admired Sparta's efficiency, its focus, its unbreakable will. Military academies still study the phalanx, leadership manuals praise Spartan discipline, and nations invoke its spirit when they demand absolute loyalty from their soldiers. But hidden beneath that admiration lies an uneasy question. Can a society built on fear and suppression truly be great? Sparta achieved immortality not through compassion or creativity, but through control. Every law, every custom, every breath was directed toward one goal: to ensure that no weakness, physical or moral, could ever threaten the state. In this, Sparta succeeded, but only by extinguishing the flame of individuality that lights the human soul. Other Greek city-states, like Athens, flourished through philosophy, art, and democracy. Their citizens debated truth, sculpted gods, and dreamed of freedom. Sparta, by contrast, built its glory on silence. Its warriors spoke little, wrote less, and left behind no monuments but graves. They were admired by others, even envied, yet their legacy was sterile. When Sparta finally declined, it left no literature, no architecture, no art, only fear, discipline, and the haunting memory of what men can become when a society worships strength above all else. And yet, there is a strange beauty in the Spartan ideal. Beneath its cruelty lay a kind of purity, the belief that greatness demanded total devotion, that freedom required sacrifice, that courage was the highest virtue. The tragedy of Sparta is not that it was evil, but that it was incomplete. It showed how far humanity can go when pushed to its limits, and how easily the line between heroism and inhumanity can blur. The Spartans lived and died believing they were protecting their world from decay, never realizing they had built a world where decay had simply taken another form, a rot of the spirit, disguised as discipline. Today, the word Spartan still evokes admiration. We use it to describe simplicity, resilience, purity of purpose. But behind that word stands the shadow of thousands of children torn from their mothers, of boys taught to kill to prove they belonged, of men who learned to suppress every feeling except loyalty and pride. The modern world remembers their strength, but forgets their suffering. The truth is that Sparta's perfection was an illusion, one purchased with silence, fear, and blood. And so we return to the image that began it all. A newborn child, lifted before the elders, his fate decided not by love but by judgment. If he was strong, he lived. If not, he was cast aside. That was Sparta's creed, that life itself must prove its worth. It was a world where survival was the only victory, where tenderness was a flaw, and where glory demanded everything. But as history looks back upon that world, the lesson becomes clearer. True strength is not found in the eradication of weakness. It is found in the courage to face it. The Spartans taught the world discipline, endurance, and unity, but they also offered a warning. When a society forgets compassion in its pursuit of power, it builds walls of bronze that even its own people cannot escape. The legacy of Sparta endures not just in legend, but in the questions it leaves behind. What does it truly mean to be strong? Is survival without humanity still victory? These questions echo through time, as eternal as the mountain winds that once carried the cries of Spartan children. And as the film fades to black, a single line remains, a truth whispered from the past to every age that seeks greatness at any cost. In Sparta, every child was born for war. But only a few ever learned how to live.